Initializing Enduring Play Podcast, Season 2 Engine. Decompressing audio. Synchronizing waveforms. Reticulating splines. Launching Podcast Lobby. Welcome back to Enduring Play, the podcast where we explore what it takes to create video games that don't just survive, but thrive. I'm your host, Cheryl Platts, video game designer, director, and author of the Game Development Strategy Guide from Rosenfeld Media. Enduring Play Season 2 is about scaling our game development ideas beyond the individual. A common thread through most of our conversations is the collective, through communities of game developers, through game education, through games research, and through the events and systems that support the releases and people making our games. Few games are released in a vacuum, so how do we scale together? Today's guest, Timothy Staton-Davis, took his experience working on some of the top action games of the past decade, God of War Ragnarok, Marvel's Avengers, and most recently, the upcoming action RPG Wu-Tang: Rise of the Deceiver with Brass Lion Entertainment, and parlayed all of that into creating a unique role as cultural technical game designer and creative director of the Melanated Game Kitchen Collective in Los Angeles. Timothy helps teams create culturally aware, rich, unique games. And that is so important in an era where AI can help us create very vanilla games. It is hyper-local, hyper-unique stories that will resonate and take us into the next generation of gaming. It is people like Timothy that can help us get around the homogeneity of LLMs and get back to grounded storytelling. And of course, Timothy is an educator and a community organizer, so he's perfect for this season. We are better as a collective. Loading episode preview.
Oh, at some point, someone mentioned this feels like Get Out, because I think Jordan Peele, as an example, has threaded that needle really well with his movies of presenting things that are very personal to certain groups of people that maybe everyone doesn't notice, but doing it in a way that's entertaining, scary, but also makes you be in that character's experience by putting yourself in that experience, which is a very unique thing with games, especially. You have to choose actions to take and think about why to take those actions. That process hopefully enables that kind of learning.
Let's get into the game. Player 1, Cheryl Platts, pronouns she, her. Player 2, Timothy Staton-Davis, pronouns he, him. Podcast level, start. Welcome back to Enduring Play, the podcast where we discuss what it takes to make games that don't just survive, but thrive. I am very excited today to be here with Timothy Staton-Davis, creative director and co-founder of Melanated Game Kitchen, alumnus of the Entertainment Technology Center over at Carnegie Mellon. There's so many other titles and things that you have done and seen, but I'm going to let you cover that in a second. Thank you for being here today, Timothy.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Also, shout out to the Entertainment Technology Center, right?
Yes. One of the OG places where you could really get that cross-disciplinary exposure. One of the things that really struck me at GDC was how many more programs there are that are multidisciplinary there. And I'm really glad about that because that's what makes games thrive. But that's one of the things I really appreciated about our time at the Entertainment Technology Center. So I always like to give my guests a chance to introduce themselves to the audience in their own terms. So if you were at the Game Developers Conference and you met somebody for the first time, how would you introduce yourself and your work to them?
I think typically, depending on who I talk to, I kind of switch things up a little bit. But generally speaking, I'm a cultural technical game designer, kind of TM created. I do cultural consultation, also game design consultation, been making games for about 10-ish years at this point, working largely within different game design disciplines, primarily a lot of action games in particular. So worked on God of War Ragnarok, most recently the Wu-Tang: Rise of the Deceiver action RPG that's still upcoming. Spent time on Marvel's Avengers, Halo Infinite, and got a chance to work at Monolith before they had closed down on the Shadow of War game, and got a chance to just do a lot of combat action focused design and systems design kind of stuff, and eventually making my way to just kind of combine a lot of those things into like storytelling as a whole. And at this point now, I kind of have a larger focus on bringing all those things into play for a more like cultural perspective for games and making sure that they're accurate and expressive of different backgrounds and stories from people's different experiences into gameplay experiences. And yeah, at this point in my career, I've been heavily involved in diversity initiatives pretty much since I started working in games, just kind of like getting more people of different backgrounds into game making and supporting us in that process. So I'm currently on the board for Black in Gaming, which is a nonprofit organization focused on Black diaspora and helping and supporting those creators and helping us to bring opportunities for them. And then, as you mentioned before, creative director and co-owner of the Melanated Game Kitchen, which is a collective and studio that's offering different types of co-development services, but we're also doing our own games as well that are focused on cultural storytelling in particular. So yeah.
It's so many things. Thank you for what your pitch is very well refined for such a diverse set of experience. I think that would take me like 40 minutes to walk through. So I salute you.
Podcast Level 1, Intersecting Cultural Design and Technical Design.
You know, one of the questions I had right up front, and you got to this a little bit, but I want to lean into it a little bit more specifically. When I was looking at your background, there was this reference to the role of a technical cultural game designer, right? And that sort of dances with some roles people may be familiar with, technical designer, cultural design. And I wanted to lean into that a little bit more. How do you describe that role? Is it two different roles? Is it one combined role? Or how did you discover this line of work?
Yeah, it's still an evolving thing, right? Because it's kind of like a phrase, a term that I've kind of made for myself that I felt was like descriptive of my background and what I do and the things that I know. I'm a computer science major and programmer by trade. And eventually I started focusing more on game design as a whole and the whole technical design of creating tools, creating prototypes, helping to enable the development process more easily and being able to make my own things. And so I focus on the technical designer aspect of things. And that was pretty much my focus for a long time. It's skills. How do I help support to make things in the games and be a designer who can build stuff as well as create ideas, right? It was just highly valuable. And then as I began to focus more on storytelling, I started bridging the aspect of my culture, but other people's culture and how to interpret and integrate different backgrounds and different experiences into the game experience as a whole, right? So I think kind of examples of that kind of lean on, we see a lot of games that kind of explore, Middle Earth or things that explore, sci-fi, these ideas, these worlds, right? And finding ways to bring those lore, bring the characters into the actual gameplay moments, right? And make that kind of feel it real and make it feel connected to those characters and that world that is built on, right?
Loading. Podcast Level 2, Cultural Technical Design Case Study.
That is so interesting. Can you give an example of a game or experience that you think reflects the ideals of what good cultural technical game design looks like in practice?
A great game that did a great job at that recently was a Despelote, which came out last year, which kind of takes this core experience of living in South America and then that is the gameplay of going through that experience and the actions that you do are what those characters do and you hear the sounds and you get the visual elements that are very unique to that experience. And so it's heavily emphasize bringing those things together. How do you make that happen? How do you design those things to happen? How do you connect the narrative and the gameplay together so that they all support each other over time and still support that core experience that you're trying to give of that background and that culture, and this expands culture from a very large perspective for people. So that's the really fun part, really unique things about games in particular.
Loading. Podcast Level 3, Localization and Hyperlocal Design.
There's so much there. When I was working at Riot, they're seeing how Valorant found its success, there was a lot about the hyper local, like finding local designers to help create characters that felt like they were resonant. But that was more of a storytelling focus, right? Like what's really fascinating about what you just described was it's taking that like hyper local or hyper cultural focus, and then because you are also someone who understands the engine and understands the technology, you can say like, yes, I understand what this culture or this locality or something is trying to say, and here are the specific game mechanics or the specific way I could change this engine to make this feel completely unique and completely immersive. Am I interpreting that right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And it has like, there's so many different pieces to it, right? Because this also gets into the localization piece of it too. Those of us who kind of focus on like, when you localize something, how do you also make sure it's relevant in the culture? Right? And so I think it's like the term is like culturalization at this point for that. But like, it's also about like the process of translating the information, which, I work with friends who like do translations, but then it's like, how do we make sure that the new words or the new verbiage or the aspects of the experience are like relevant for those people, or that is not offensive for those people in that location, right? That's like also part of it too. It's like a lot of like multifaceted pieces.
Loading. Tutorial level. The rise of Rays at Riot Games.
During my tenure at Riot Games in 2022, Valorant launched the agent Rays, who is positioned as a dancing Salvadorian duelist. As a reminder, this podcast is not sponsored or endorsed by any past or present employers. In a case study about the design and launch of Rays, the team behind her design shared how they collaborated closely with Riot's Brazilian team to figure out how to represent her. From the selection of her hometown to groundbreaking collaborations on the music she listens to, the work they did on this agent was guided directly by locals from the region Rays is based in. A manager of brand management from the Brazilian team in Sao Paulo, Rodrigo Frigi, said,
"The Valorant team came to the Brazilian office and asked should she be from Sao Paulo, Rio, or Salvador. The team came to us for help, for references, for decisions. That meant a lot to us, and we were able to help make an agent that means a lot to Brazilian players. It may sound counterintuitive, but in order to truly be global, we have to be hyper-local."
Think about that. To be global, we have to be hyper-local. In a world where AI can generate infinite stories, these deeply authentic, deeply grounded stories are the ones that will resonate not just with those who live them, but with those who cannot live them, but appreciate the chance to experience part of that magic.
Loading. Podcast level 4. Culturalization and transcreation.
So the culturalization part, a term I've also heard is transcreation. Are those two things related? Have you heard that before? Or are those potentially different things?
It sounds similar. I haven't heard transcreation before, but it sounds like it's transcreation. Yeah.
It might be in the same space. Okay, I'll have to dig into that more. So, why don't we dig more into the culturalization piece of it? So I think I understand what you're talking about, but I want to dig in more to A, challenge my assumptions, and B, so our listeners can get a richer sense. Because I remember what it was like when I was working on Sims games and learning how to simultaneously ship a game on multiple platforms, and having my mind blown for the first time, like 2003, when they were like, yeah, we changed some of the skins for the characters and some of the cultures because there's different cultural norms. I'm like, you ship a different game on different cartridges, different, like, yeah, that was baby. But in my brain, obviously we're much more sophisticated now, but basic concept. Am I on the right track?
Definitely. Yeah. It's always super surprising when those things happen that like sometimes you just don't know about it, especially when it comes to like Asian countries in particular, because they can be like a lot more like strict about things, or like certain things that like, oh, I didn't know that particular color combination meant this or was offensive in this way. Or it's like, you just don't know until you make it and then look into it, and then someone tells you, oh yeah, that's not good, right? Or this means this. So yeah, that's part of the process for sure. I was thinking about, we were working with someone in the title that's very much still in production and development, but they're like kind of dealing with this whole thing of like mixed race, mixed ethnicity for their main character, and it's kind of like based in Japan, and we have friends that we work with in Japan who are also from the U.S., so we kind of have this kind of like cross-cultural kind of combination thing going on. We have these conversations, and so some of like the nuance for the character, and also like how they would approach the narrative situations if they were like someone who was mixed race but also born in Japan. And so like, what are the dynamics that come with being that based on the cultural situation in that particular location, right? It's like, okay, like here's how people would approach her if, this thing happened because of this background and how like this would be perceived in their culture versus like if we put that same character in the United States, it wouldn't be a big deal at all. We wouldn't think anything of it for that particular scenario. So it's kind of the things like, okay, let's talk about it. And like, let's also make sure we, pull in a couple people that we can reach out to can add a little extra context from that perspective or from that generational perspective in particular. So that's kind of like the kind of research that's like important to do and like to identify like how do you like build these things out for the characters and for the scenarios. Yeah.
Podcast level paused. Begin host commentary.
We've touched on culturalization in gaming in previous episodes, like Season 1, Episode 4, where David Ventura's company helped studios navigate the transition between European and Asian cultures. The nuance of Tim's work as a cultural technical designer touches on similar themes, but perhaps from the inverse. In many cases, he's working to make a game more nuanced and specific and authentic, and then partner with localizers around the world to make sure that authenticity translates across cultural boundaries. For example, a cultural consultant like Tim might help a game develop a hyper-local narrative around a very specific neighborhood in the US. And then when that game wants to ship in Japan, they might work with a studio like David Ventura's Ichigo-ichi Games to figure out how that very specific story's emotional arc can translate across cultural boundaries while honoring any local laws, customs, or norms. As a gamer, you're typically only ever interacting with one version of your favorite game, so you might not even know that the stories, characters, or even gameplay you're familiar with plays out differently in other locales. But that's been true at some level for decades. One of the most classic examples of this switch is the O and X buttons on PlayStations. If you've ever tried to use Japanese and English PlayStations, you may have noticed that those two buttons don't always behave the same in different regions. O is typically select on Japanese consoles, but X is typically select on Western consoles. This might be because in Japan, school tests are marked with a red pen with a circle next to correct answers. And that level of detail is why the work that Tim does is so interesting and important.
Loading podcast level 5. Making the case for authenticity through impact.
We've had film for a long time, and I think there were cultural consultants for film, but it's so much more important, I think, when players are embodying these characters and they're living these experiences. The fact that like when we're in Avatar, we can end up embodying those characters. So what if the character or what if the environment doesn't match reality, or if it's causing cognitive dissonance, or it's causing us to misinterpret how a culture really exists? Like I think sometimes people might think like, well, why is this important, or why is this so hard? Do you find that you have to pitch people on the importance of this? Like, how do people find you and find your business? And how do you convince them that this is something that's necessary and needed?
Yeah. That's such an interesting question, because I think it's like a continued thing that's evolving based on like just like the social landscape in the world, right? Because I know for me in particular, like I think it's been maybe about a year and a half or so that I started actually like offering this as a service for other creators or other studios, right? And so, there's other people who are colleagues who have been also doing cultural consulting for different things. Like, for example, Spider-Man, Marvel Spider-Man, like Miles and like Spider-Man 2, they had cultural consultation for like New York, right? And for also like getting like Miles' Spider-Man character correct and his family dynamics and stuff like that, and building out quests and all that. And so, I think in those situations, right, like the studio is like, they understand that the fans want a accurate character and they want to make sure that they're represented correct to fit the comics, largely correctly, and also feel like it's like real, make it feel like true. So their focus was, I want a real New York, right? And I want a real New York and our characters to be real. And so they knew that they needed to find people to bring in to capture that essence properly, right? And so I think in those cases, yes. And there's a lot of proven case that there's a lot of value in that, because when it's accurate, then the people who understand this character, understand this world the best, even for all of our, books turned movies, books turned games, we see that when it's done well, accurate to the characters in the world, people will see it. People will spend money on it. But if it's not, people will trash it. They will not respect it as much. And so there's obviously a big value, but it's been a large thing of presenting it in the way we're still kind of like in a battle of presenting it that it has value, even though it's proven. There's still some kind of like dynamic from the big business perspective that is not assumed or is not thought about initially. So it does take some work as far as like even on my part of like, how do I present the information in a way that makes them understand what this does for their experience and like why this is important and why this ultimately like likely lead to more sales down the road, essentially. And it is like largely about some language adjustments for how I write things out in a way that's tailored to different people or different businesses, or the description of, okay, the impact that is going to give for your company, right? And here's how this would fit in, and is largely having to pitch it in that way every time. Still, so it's tricky still. Yeah.
It's funny how the impact thing, being able to phrase what we want to do in terms of the impact is going to have, is one of the hardest things we do in any corporate or business environment. Like when I coach my directs on the annual review process and stuff, okay, apologies, because this is going to feel really corporate, but let's reframe what you're saying in terms of impact it had on the other people. This is a really good list of tasks. What did it do? Like I hear that in what you're saying, like you had to go through that whole process so that you convey like, yes, we do all these things, but here's what it's going to do for you. That like secret sauce of what it does for you as opposed to what I can do. Being able to change that mindset has been so transformational in like every business I've been in and every group I've been in. And it's cool to hear you talk about how you're doing it for your space and your very unique context.
Loading podcast level 6, leaning away from AI to complete the cultural loop.
And I wonder too, like when you talk about the value of the work that you do, it feels like whether it's explicitly stated or not, whether you're on this trajectory towards even higher importance, because some of the conversations I'm having are around the effect of AI, right? And the loss of authenticity, right? Like if two outputs are the same, what like the human and the non-human, the authenticity, it's the groundedness.
It's grounded,
that's the only thing that differentiates them. And it's the work that you do that makes sure it's grounded in real human experience. So it feels like the types of work that you do, it's going to be more important than ever to make sure that we haven't been pulled off the path by some random like ChatGPT brainstorm that's telling us about a world that doesn't exist.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, that's the thing. Like everything needs like a human touch to it. Even research. You know, you're doing research on a topic or a group of people. It is largely been proven. And a friend of mine, Jairus, he does a lot of work in regards to like art, 3D art, but like that's focused on Africa, or pulling from Africa and like their culture. And a lot of things that will come up is that like if you just search for things normally when you're trying to dig into like detail on a world, this is fictional and non-fictional worlds and backgrounds that you may not find all the information just on a normal search and just on checking one of the AI logs and like, hey, search this for me and like pull this up, and you'll get some stuff, but it's just going to be like very surface level. You're not going to capture like a lot of that like more detail of like the people who are actually like immersed in this world. It's not going to like cut it. It's going to be like very like caricature of it. And so it does require another level of digging, or just like talking with the right people or getting the right books or the right reference material to properly represent what you're building it off of. And sometimes that requires like reading an actual like physical thing somewhere, or going to a library, or like having the right interviews and reaching out to the right folks who have that lived experience or have that like tome of knowledge to like ask them the questions and like get the details from them directly. And that takes time. And it takes some effort that, folks who are trying to like really be quick about it are not going to get just with a simple AI search and compiling of that information, no matter how much they do it. And it's just not going to pull from the right sources. If you're going to, you can use the tools to do some of like the groundwork, but you have to dig into more to capture the essence better. And people notice it. I think is like very largely the case. It stands out.
Loading podcast level 7, specificity, immediacy, and speculation.
I'm glad you brought up some of the techniques you use, because I think that to bring the AI thread along, one of the weaknesses of a lot of these AI tools is that many of them, the way they're trained, they sort of have an expiration date, right? Their models run out of runway. I love the examples where people ask an AI what date it is, like Gemini or something, and it's like, it's 2024. But if you're doing research for a game and you're asking about cultural conditions and your AI thinks it's 2024 and you don't do the groundwork, it's super old and everybody's going to know. And the thing they know the most about is popular culture. No one's forgiving if you go put flossing in your game, right? They'll be like, what are they? Good God. Who did they get? It's a great example of how you, sure, even in this era where all the information is theoretically available to you, you got to do the work because life is constantly changing. Life finds a way. People are evolving. And the best insight is the stuff that just happened.
It just happened. Right. I very much agree with that. Very much agree. I think a lot about, from time to time, I like to dig into some the futurism stuff a bit, right? Some of the prototypes and any things that I've worked on in the past and probably will work on still is things that are hypothetical what ifs type of scenarios of, what if this culture evolved into 100, 200 years in the future of what if these kind of things happened in the past and now what it would look like in modern day, these kinds of explorations. And they're really fun to do, but it does give me to the thing of, specificity, because if you change just small things, for example, if certain foods did not make their way over to the U.S. At a certain point, right? And what would the food look like? What would the recipes look like actually in the world? And then if you had a game based around modern day, what would the characters actually be eating now if that happened, right? Yeah, you could do a quick search of oh, what if this happened, and then plug it into ChatGPT or Claude or something and see what comes up. But you have to ask the very specific questions to kind of build on top of, okay, so if these foods did not cross over and they stayed here, then, okay, what would it be here? And then how would that evolve over time? You have to specifically track that and build that kind of case of what it would be. And then you can form, here's what it would be like in 2026, And it's an interesting process to think like that, of trying to build those kinds of ideas out. Also, if you're using any AI tools, you have to guide their hand along the way with that process, I think, to figure out those answers.
Coding Podcast Level 8, Confronting the Nuance in AI Use Ethically.
That's a really interesting use of AI because, the weaknesses of AI being a statistical model, being trained on things, maybe lean into that as an actual valid use case, because it's what would be a probabilistic outcome if I changed this one piece, go back through all the data and run it through all the language again and see how humans would react if I pulled French fries out of the vernacular. What would it do? That's really interesting. And you're basically running a simulation at that point, but doing it with prompt engineering. That's a very cool exploration of how modern tools help and hurt. And, there's a lot of nuance in the world right now, right?
There's a lot of nuance. And a lot of people who are trying to not pay attention to that nuance, who would say it doesn't matter, right? I know me and my team are, in a lot of other studios, indie and larger, or the conversation is, okay, how do we use these tools in a way that is equitable and good? How do we define how to use these tools in a way that is good and not stealing from other people and not doing harm? And so it is up to us as the creators who care to figure this stuff out, because the others who don't care are going to abuse it as much as they can, right? And so, we're talking and we're exploring and keeping note of the different tools as they come out, and some of us are using some of them and trying them out in ways of how can we utilize them in small ways, and that feels good and is right for everybody. So it's a constant conversation, I think, and we, a lot of it is kind of private testing of exploring, okay, what if we did it with this, and what can it do this way? And, is this too much? Or how's our data being used here? Do we want to not, do it this way, right? So that's kind of a continued conversation and evolution we're figuring out too. Yeah.
In my personal, very, individual life, talking to people about the use of AI, one of the common concerns time and time again are models are trained unethically without consent, which is not something that's easily changeable. The environmental impact, which is not something that's easily changeable. And then how the data is handled, which is something that you can, read terms of service, you can prepare for.
on those first two counts, I'm not going to ask you to endorse things because that's not what we're here for. But like, do you have a perspective on do we need sea change to get to a point where these tools are meaningful and useful? Some folks are like, it's irredeemable. We can't use the current generation of tools because we just don't know where it all came from.
Yeah. And I go back and forth because I have people in our collective who, feel both ways about it too, right? Especially the artists in particular, because they've been stolen from the most and they've been impacted the most, I think. And it's like really, really frustrating for them. And I feel it. And it's like, I get that. It is tricky. And I'm very adamant about language around everything, really. But this stuff in particular about technology, the language that we use to define things, I'm very adamant about. In most conversations I'm having, what particular tech are you talking about, right? Are you talking about generative AI? Are you talking about LLM models? Are you just talking about AI tooling that we've been using for years in different ways that we've made locally, right? That is important in conversation, especially as like social conversation for making sure people have knowledge of how to use terms, And so, I have to talk about this and say, as long as we are paying attention to how our data is being used and doing what we can do to protect our data, to protect our people, make sure stuff is not being, used in a certain way, as long as we're not doing things that are going to exacerbate harm intentionally, then, we can explore the details, right? So we can get clear information about, this stuff stole from these artists and did it this way. And their company is investing in things like this. It's like, well, okay, we should not even entertain it. And then areas where it's like, okay, we can see that this company hasn't done anything bad like this stuff yet. Maybe we can mess with the technology, but let's also be cautious in how we use our data and how we mess with it and not be dependent upon it if something does happen. So largely, how do we build our own things as well locally to make sure that we build our own pipelines for things and still, have a backup plan if stuff goes south as we're exploring the technology. Yeah, that's kind of the perspective I've taken on a lot of it.
Thank you for navigating that with me. These conversations are so challenging to have without leaning into the strong It's so easy to just be like, I don't like it. I don't want it, right? Like I have wanted to have that reaction too, but also I understand that if we don't engage in those spaces, other people who aren't going to treat the technology ethically will just continue to consume all the oxygen and do the things. And so those of us who are like, it is because we don't like having the conversations that we have to go have the conversations and deal with the things. So thank you for navigating it with me, even though, sometimes it's not always the favorite thing. And as you say, sometimes as game designers, we have had AI in our life in the past. I have designed games with like little autonomous creatures in them that did things. And now I'm like, what do I call that? So people don't hate that. Right? Like, what am I going to do with that word? It was AI then, and it's what now?
It's the same term.
An interesting thing, especially in game development, where you're like, suddenly the thing that I've been doing this whole time is not allowed. Okay. You were fine with that yesterday. You liked NPCs. You liked it when they were talented and good at competing. And now you do not want anything with those two letters.
Right.
So yeah, nuance is our friend. We don't want to do the unethical things, but we would still like single player games. So we got to figure that out.
Very true.
Got to figure it out.
Podcast Level 9, The Narrative Design of Clock Out at 2.
Let's talk some more about your specific work because there's so much interesting here. And one of the games you were promoting at the time I was looking into your work is Clock Out at 2. And this game helps you tell the story of working as an Afro-Latina. And I think, especially after the conversation we had earlier in this podcast, I would love to hear more about how the game design choices are specifically helping you tell the story of living life as an Afro-Latina in the workplace. Like maybe that can help people understand your very specific sort of perspective on your skill set and how it's coming to bear on unique storytelling and giving people a visual lived experience.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought out Clock Out too. Yeah, I would say it's kind of like our flagship title, as I've been telling people a bit at the moment. It is a classic collaborative game project between our studio, Melanated Game Kitchen, and our sister studio, Borderless Studios. And we've been working together for a while now on various things, but this is like the big project we've been building together. And Clock Out at 2 is a narrative adventure thriller game experience that you are surviving the corporate machine, your workplace, to essentially clock out of work by 2 p.m. essentially. And we kind of consider it akin to, for folks who like are in film, right? We kind of say, oh, it's like Get Out, Jordan Peele, and then kind of meets like Severance, which is like also on the craze the last couple of years, and the kind of like a combination of those kind of two things, because as your character, you're navigating a workplace where your experience of it is different from everybody else's. And so we're kind of playing into that because things are not as they seem. Things are dark. That are happening, and how you experience the things and how they're directed towards you is in a way that's very harmful, in a way that's deceitful, and maybe it's not intentionally done that way, but because of your background, who you are, you're experiencing microaggressions, and the way that that shows up in your body, how that shows up in your perspective, how that affects your mental health and well-being affects your progression through the game, right? And so that's the interesting dynamic that we're playing with.
Narrative cutscene, Get Out, Severance, and storytelling.
Let's get some context on those two pieces of media Tim mentioned to help you fully appreciate this next case study. Jordan Peele's Get Out is an Academy Award-winning psychological horror film from 2017 where racial relations became a key plot point. Not everything or everyone is as they seem in Get Out. Severance is a popular recurring series on Apple TV that centers around a workplace, Lumen Industries, where certain employees choose to become severed so that they have no connection to or memory of their consciousness at the workplace. These versions of themselves are essentially adult children, and this leads to heavy use of gamification to motivate productivity, since typical techniques like promotion and money won't work. Employees are tracked on their completion or mastery of particular files and pitted against each other competitively for prizes and recognition. There's even a pixelated cinematic of the company founder for a job well done at the end of some tasks. While Jordan Peele's Get Out is probably being brought up for its relevance to the racial context in Clock Out at 2, and how both pieces of media are trying to get people to see perspectives they cannot live, Severance is a really interesting look at the darker side of gamification and power dynamics, in addition to the suspense it brings to the table.
Podcast Level 10, Exploring the Workplace with Game Design.
Tell me more about your role on Clock Out at 2 and how you're blending all of your various talents to make this story real.
And it's really interesting to been working on this because I kind of function as like one of the game designers on it, along with the owner of the studio and narrative design lead, creative director of the game, Mac, is kind of finding ways of like telling an interesting story. It deals with kind of like a butterfly effect scenario of having to repeat the day until you can succeed. And so having to tell the story of these interactions that you interact with, very nice white man, cis white man, but his interactions with you are much not wanted. A lot of his advances on your character, and then also dealing with HR and how they treat you, and dealing with company policy in a way that tries to suck out your own personality, right? And so we kind of play around with, of course, having a narrative that shows these incidents, right, and how that affects your character, but also, how as a person you can grow and learn how to navigate these situations and how to get through your own personal traumas that you've experienced as a result of living in this lifestyle, and find a way to navigate it where you can come out of it and survive, right? Because it is a survival process. So we've kind of integrated some different systems into it to kind of like reflect that survival process of how different things that you can add to your traits and to your character and stats that can help in different scenarios and help with different conversations and help you to advocate for yourself in different ways. Taking inspiration from other RPGs. I've even had a conversation like some stuff like Disco Elysium, for example, or other like roguelike experiences on, ways that we can represent the character through systems, right? And also playing up on the thriller element of things of like, using art, using animation, and in the conversations and the different things that you can select in conversations, as far as, certain things that you can and can't say. And if you say something that is aggressive towards a certain person, even though you said it, even though that's the right thing to say, and, as you feel or that's appropriate because of stress that you're experiencing as your character, and because of the social dynamic that's happening between this character and you, it will affect you negatively in the story. So we're trying to find ways of like systemically adding these pieces and adding these, ways of tracking information and giving you choices that reflect who you are as a person, but also reflect the dynamic to represent that experience. So people who have experienced it before in real life will understand it deeply. And we've seen this happen in our playtesting, in our demos at different places that we've, shown the game so far, right? And people who have not experienced this will be like, oh, that's what's happening here with this, I didn't think this was a bad thing when it happened to this character, or, as we were talking, but actually I was like, no, you got to back off, or, you got to leave me alone, or no, like they're feeling for the main character in a way that maybe they hadn't thought about in the past, and so we think it's trying to strike a nice balance between, like, that's why it's a horror thing, trying to strike a nice balance between those interactions and making it somewhat educational, of like understanding this experience, but also like the fun aspect of having to figure out how to navigate this stuff and how to win and how to, become a better like person, or in that process. Yeah.
Podcast Level 11, Education as a Motivator of Play.
Sounds so interesting. It sounds like there's game mechanics that teach personal resilience,
right,
in an educational way, which is when I talk about the motivators of play in my book. And one of the reasons people are coming to games in more ways is education. And it's because games have become more sophisticated. Sometimes it's the brute force of Duolingo just has 100 languages, but there's also this really intentioned craftsmanship of how do we build a game that will guide you through a difficult situation and help you get to the point where you can see a metaphor about life and go through a difficult situation in a safe space enough times that you can apply that life skill in a different way next time. And it sounds like this is a really interesting environment for that. Exactly
that. Yeah. It is it's a needle to thread, of course, for this kind of stuff, which is why, at some point someone mentioned this feels like Get Out, because I think Jordan Peele, as an example, has threaded that needle really well with his movies of presenting things that are very personal to certain groups of people, right? That maybe everyone doesn't notice or realize, but doing it in a way that's entertaining, scary, but also makes you be in that character's experience. And so by putting yourself in that experience, which is a very unique thing of the games, especially, you have to like choose actions to take and think about why they take those actions, right? That process is hopefully enables that like kind of learning just by doing it. So that's the part that's fun and also challenging at the same time.
Loading, tutorial level, multimodality.
I'm about to use the term multimodal, and I recognize that not all of my listeners are as much a nerd about that term as I am. Life is inherently multimodal. Well, maybe not this podcast. Multimodal interactions involve multiple modes of input or output sequentially or simultaneously. That might mean static visuals, animated visuals, haptic physical feedback, kinetic physical feedback, auditory feedback, or other modalities like ambient interactions. Games are generally deeply multimodal. You are taking player input for one or more sources, then giving the player multiple forms of feedback like animated visuals, vibration, or audio. My first book, Design Beyond Devices, is all about multimodality and cross-device experiences, as I've always been fascinated by experiences like the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, and that took me to working on experiences like Cortana and Alexa. And those experiences were made possible by my time working on a launch title for the very multimodal Nintendo DS. Most of your players and their devices have many senses, sensors, and outputs. How many of those are you using to the fullest? This is not an endorsement of having players lick their devices, by the way.
Podcast Level 12, Multimodal Narrative for Suspense and Immersion.
How do you approach your visual or your multimodal presentation? Is it like immersive? Is it mobile? Like, because you mentioned microaggressions and you mentioned mental health, and that struck me because it's like, how do you convey that? Like, how do you convey the impact that this is having to someone with a different cultural identity than the player, who might process that differently than the character?
Right. Yeah, for us, we've taken an interesting angle at it. I think different creatives would do different things with it, right? So our inspiration initially was like leaning into art aspect of horror aspect of it. And that's why I call it a thriller, because it's not like a scary game per se, but it's got stuff that it's not right. Things are off, and leaning into that kind of thing of like, this is what it feels like to be in this situation. It feels creepy. It feels like you see things that other people don't see. And how does that affect your mental health when, you tell someone, this is who this person is, this is how they are to me, but then they never see it that way, right? And how kind of scary that kind of feels, So we're kind of leaning into the art aspect of like making that feel kind of creepy and making characters seem different than they actually are on the surface, right? And that's kind of like that kind of horror element of it, of using art as a way to kind of communicate that. And the team's done a great job at messing around with that like aspect of it and the art style of that. It's kind of like a very like 2D focused art style, not like a cartoon per se, but it's kind of got that vibe and kind of capturing that feeling of unease. And so that kind of helps a lot.
2D seems like, I mean, there's probably no right or wrong answers, but our collective experience at the Entertainment Technology Center, one of the things I liked about our storytelling classes, they leaned into Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud and the whole,
oh yeah,
like, hey, the more richly rendered you get, the harder it is to project yourself into a story. And so that seems to make a lot of sense to me. If you're asking someone to project them into a story that is very much not themselves, keeping it low fidelity in a way makes it easier for their brain to say like, okay, cool, maybe I can slot you in here. It's not it's not a fully 4K but realized like life thing. It's like, oh, it's a comic, it's story. I can find space. So that vibes that makes sense. It's really interesting. And the oh, that person seems fine to me. Like, yeah. I mean, that's
right.
Resonant in a way I wish it wasn't. But I'm glad you're trying to give some people that perspective of something like, okay, fine. Maybe society hasn't recognized that people can be different ways in different places. We will just teach it in game mechanics. Fine.
Right. Fine. That is so funny.
Podcast level paused. Begin host commentary.
As we shift gears, let's reflect a little bit on the season journey thus far. The nuance in the game mechanics Tim talks about in Clock Out by 2, workplace trauma, microaggressions, navigating workplace systems, reflect a desire to help others see a complexity in the system that is not always accepted at first glance. I can't know what these designers have lived through, but as a disabled woman leader in tech, I know I've been, quote unquote, accidentally fired coming back from disability leave, denied accommodations, ignored, had my rights violated, and all by people who seem nice to others. Most of these cases were because the companies I worked with didn't have proactive people partners like Amy White from season 2, episode 6, who looked to prevent problems instead of just react to them. And I think this is a chronic problem in gaming because we're so focused on the game and not the long term. I know I'll be playing Clock Out at 2 to see how this lived experience through Afro-Latina eyes contrasts or aligns with my lived experience, as this is one of the only ways for me to do so. And for those who are lucky enough not to live these experiences at all, games like this not only give you a chance to explore suspense and mystery, but maybe even build some new resilience and empathy you can take with you without having to build that lived experience. That modern motivator of play of education I talk about in my book. Games don't just have to be comforting or fun. They can make us better, too.
Podcast level 13. Introducing Black in Gaming.
You mentioned that you're on the board of Black in Gaming. Tell me more about your work with that organization.
Yeah, Black in Gaming as a nonprofit has been around for over a decade, technically, and have been doing a lot of things heavily at GDC in particular. Like they're the founders and continued hosts of the Black Gaming Awards, which is an award show that gives recognition to people who are doing great things in the Black game industry. For me, a perspective, I joined the nonprofit as a community member initially, and also kind of helping with a lot of their online community building for Discord servers and that space, and kind of bringing more of us into the space, collaborating, supporting each other and just kind of providing like a safe space to talk about things and figure stuff out and navigate the industry. And so it's grown as far as like a community space substantially since 2020. At this point, also our nonprofit is in this growth period as well. I joined the board last year along with some other colleagues of mine who we've been working together, and our focus largely is to support Black game creators and then also provide them opportunities. So I have a couple different areas that we focus on largely. In particular, one is like a big thing is like investment and funding of people, because oftentimes marginalized communities, we don't get as much funding for our projects, and opportunities for funding in particular is also a big one. And so we do that via collaborations and also sponsorships and other things that we're working on to do. And then also having to deal with the promotion of creative works and promotion of individuals who may not get the same kind of recognition that we would get in other spaces, So we focus heavily on that. Also, safety is a big one, as we may have seen. I think all of our affinity groups that we've also cross-collaborated with all kind of have a focus on this, that, those of us of different backgrounds have experienced a lot of hate online for various reasons. And the games that we release sometimes garner that hate, and our companies don't always support us, right? So outside entities that exist to help provide that support. And so we're bolstering that effort to do more of that. And who else is going to come from a lot of cases? And then also doing efforts to just increase representation of different people, different experiences, and different backgrounds in the game industry as a whole, and in the games that we make as well, and helping to bridge those gaps, helping to fill in, provide resources and provide opportunities for studios and other individuals to be encouraged to do so, best practices, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of different areas, and we're collaborating with a lot of different organizations, kind of like sister organizations who are also passionate about improving representation and improving opportunity within the space for creators. We just had a great event back at GDC, which I think is just a sign of the times, right? Where we collaborated with Latinx in gaming and AAPI in gaming as a group collaborative event that we put on to provide a showcase and provide talks for developers, especially indie developers, to have a space to share their stuff and to have a focus on what we were creating as a whole, and then also collaborating with other organizations to get that stuff out even from a bigger audience as well. So it's largely about that stuff. And if anyone wants to support, obviously we're taking donations and all that. Is a 501c3 nonprofit. So, I'll provide the links and stuff like that. But very passionate about trying to help to push that stuff further, continued every year.
Podcast level 14. Collaboration across nonprofit video game organizations.
I love the approach to collaborating with other organizations. It's so smart, not trying to take everything on, but being laser focused on what is our unique perspective, and then how do we get all these other organizations together and better than the sum of the parts. It feels like there's this new generation of nonprofits, maybe not since the pandemic, but I don't know, in the last decade or two, that understand that they don't all have to be monolithic, that they each come in from a very unique perspective. What does this group of organizers bring? How does this group of organizers work with this group of organizers? And collectively, how do we solve problems? What do you think is unique about Black in gaming's perspective when you mentioned like partnering with these other groups at GDC? Like, what's your specialty?
In particular, there is a focus on, I think, this like educational aspect and community building in particular, because as you mentioned, right, a lot of us had the kind of conversations over the past decade and plus. Like early on, there was not a lot of different people that were creating organizations to help these issues, right? You had one, maybe, because you had to find people, right? And there wasn't a lot of opportunity for us to even stay in the industry for a while, right? And so over the years, now it's like a lot of different orgs that have popped up who have this like intersectionality of it all. So it's like, okay, there's a group for women in gaming, there's a group for Black women in gaming specifically, as a group for just Black in gaming, right? And all these different groups. And so we have kind of taken, myself and others, we've been talking about like, how can we collaborate more, because we don't have to do everything at just one organization. We have specialties. Our specialty, for example, the educational aspect and like helping to provide space and resource is like a big thing, because there's not a lot of bridging of gaps between college or high school and like becoming a professional. And then also the other part largely as well is like support for Black creators. So just with our community space as a whole is provided a supportive space for early career and mid-career creators, right? To like have people to talk to, have people to learn from, and hopefully find mentorship along the way. And we're trying to expand that effort more to provide for, all pieces of, someone's career as they become senior. Everyone, there's to level up, you need some push. You need someone to help pull you along sometimes. Otherwise, it's really hard. And so we're doing more stuff to help support that effort in a way that's like more systemic or like more intentional. And so that's part of it. But then we collaborate with people like Black Voices in Gaming, who've had a big focus on providing money, opportunity, and showcase opportunity for indies. So collaborating with them on like, how can we help elevate their work? How can their stuff elevate more of what we're doing? And how can we bring in more funding and all that kind of stuff, So we're still figuring out all the jigsaw puzzle, so to speak, like where everything fits and how to make sure all that happened, but we're doing it. And I think that's like really important part is like the intention of making sure that we're all doing pieces of that puzzle, sharing, so to speak, along the way.
That's great. Thank you for walking me through that. And it was such a clear vision.
Podcast Level 15, teaching video games at the University of Southern California.
Speaking of education, you recently started teaching at USC, is that right?
Yeah. University of Southern California. Yeah. Their games program.
Can you talk a little bit about that addition to your already considerable resume?
Yeah. I just started teaching this semester as an adjunct professor. I think it's a course that's focused on game production and design. So the students, they group up at the beginning of the semester and then they have to finish a project by the end of the semester, groups of 2. And it's been a fun experience so far. I got kind of inspired by a few other colleagues of mine who were at Brass Lion also, and they had been doing some teaching at USC over the past couple of years. I think they're alumni as well. So I chatted with them a little bit here and there about that. And once I kind of started to take the stint from non-AAA work for a while and kind of going independent and doing this studio stuff on my own, I had, some space and I was like, oh, let me see, about the adjunct stuff and trying out the teaching process. I kind of do some light teaching, so to speak, in all the projects that I'm in if I'm working with people who are not at the same level as me, right? In terms of showing good production process and showing good design and documentation and how to have those like proper soft skill conversations in particular. And so I thought a natural thing was, okay, we could try the teaching thing and do that there in a way. And so it's been a good experience so far. I started doing that and had a good class of students and a lot of interesting games that they're working on and just trying to kind of navigate that, the process of being a teacher and how that comes along. Neat being called a professor,
Yeah.
So that's been pretty interesting. I might teach next semester as well. We're kind of having some conversations about that. So, but yeah, it's been an interesting way of like taking all the things that I've been doing and learning and still learning and bringing it to the students and also giving them some industry perspective along the way since I'm still making stuff, right? I think it's important for teachers to have some perspective in the actual like world of the industry, as much as possible too.
Thank you. Well, your students are lucky to have you. And I very much connect with the perspective of like, I'm also still learning the things because in my own teaching perspective, one of my favorite things is when my students do their end of quarter presentations about the games they've done case studies on. I'm like, I have learned some things about games I have not played yet and perspectives, and it always expands my horizons. But every year, people's perspective on gaming changes. They're always the same age, but I'm getting older. And that's a gift, right? Like it challenges me more every year to like, nope, got to update my perspective, got to research a little bit harder, got to push the content in different ways.
Podcast Level 16, the pre-production soapbox.
I was just talking with another educator. You mentioned documentation and you're teaching, you mentioned production was a role in the course. I'm going to get on a soapbox for a minute because we are both practitioners. We're in the space. We're doing the stuff. And I don't know if you run into this, but as somebody who runs game teams, sometimes I'm like, hello, let's do some ideation. I would like you to document your ideas. And I get some resistance. Like, hey, this is slowing me down. Hey, this feels like a lot of process. And what I was telling saying, somebody else was like, I'm grateful that I've done this enough that I have the faith. The slowing down up front speeds us up later. But I wonder is this something that you've run into? Like, what's your take on documentation? Because in an agile world, right? Like we're up against like also agile exists. We're being told we should do sprints and we should just be lightweight as heck. And so we have this sort of conflict. I mean, when I started doing game development, it was like, here's my 60-page game design document with all of its satellite game design documents. And then I came back into game design and was like, we're just vibes now?
We're just vibes. Oh boy. Yeah, that's so true. At least for this class so far, it's interesting because it's a games program, but not everybody in my class is in the games program, right? I have a couple of film students, I have a couple of students who are like CS or art students. So it's kind of like a mix of that. And so some of them have done the process before and some of them haven't, as far as like making a game or doing the whole production, process. My course is based on largely our main text is A Playful Production Process by Richard Lamontrard. Great book. I never read it when I was in school. I started off with the art of game design as like my Bible and then kind of learned the production as we went in our classes. But looking at it, I was like, oh yeah, that's all the right things. Yes, that's perfect. And so at least in our assignments, we've like made it so that they've had to do these processes and like, submit them to me to review, right? To make sure it's like, hey, this is enough detail, or it's like, oh, y'all didn't explain anything here, and making them like think about it. And so I'll have to like talk with them at the end and say like, hey, do you think this helped, right? As far as you to make your games, right? Because I check with them every week. They check their work. They have a new build for their game to look at. And so some of them have done better than others in terms of cohesion of their experience. And I think the ones who have done the best job have had the most information up front, right? And the most research up front, right? I was like, oh yeah, what it's going to be like. Here they're going to be mechanics. Here's some of the reference material of what they look like. Here's some of the level ideas that we have, right? And kind of having a good vision of that up front versus the ones who kind of like middling a little bit and that went on. I was like, oh yeah, this is not this, and oh okay, like there's not as much done here because and having to kind of give them a little bit more guidance along the way of like, hey, move this direction, or think about, or did you already think about this stuff? Did you think about these levels? How many levels do you want to have? What's going to happen in them, right? We only have this many weeks left, so.
Podcast level 17, simpler scoping for better games.
And there's this truth around like prototyping is great, right? But how many games have prototyped themselves to death? I'm not going to point out any names, any games and companies I've worked at, but like we can be too precious. Sometimes if you don't have a full idea, you can go and explore things, but sometimes simplicity is great. Simplicity is great. I've said that sentence many times this week alone. Just friends. Clarity is gift. Do one or two things really well instead of this laundry list of things sort of a lot, especially when you have a lot of people trying to collaborate on something. And 2 people isn't a lot, but it is also a lot because they are 2 different humans with 2 different ideas about stuff. So if you have a clearly identified idea or 1 or 2 clearly identified ideas, your odds of success are much higher than here is my complicated list of 72 points of game design. Like, good luck with that.
It's so true. And it's interesting because I help host game jams on an annual basis, either like tiny ones or like longer ones, and it's been like a continued process since like 4 years or so, I think at this point, outlining process of a game jam and also like recommendations of how to do a game jam and how to maximize your time and how to handle production for a jam with your team and like not overscope, right? Not do too much. Like how many people are you going to have on your team, right? Okay, this is how much time you have. Remember, this is submission window. This is your creative window, right? And you need to move into the space, right? And here's how much time you have during the week because you're also not doing the game jam every day. And these kinds of things, is a process of like elimination of like how many people do you have, and then okay, like cut back your expectations of what you can get done. Same thing for the class, right? It's like, hey, that's too much.
Cut it back.
Yeah.
It's always okay to leave people wanting more. Right. But if you bite off more than you could chew and you never finish it, then people will never want anything because they will never be able to buy your game.
They'll never see it.
That is the industry for the last 20 years.
That's true. It's very true.
final boss level. Jam with your peers to find yourself.
Well, we're almost out of time. On that note, because you mentioned, you're on your path to your education, you're doing game jams. Do you have any advice for people at that stage of the journey, doing early career, doing the smaller games, doing the game jams? Like, is there anything you wish you had known early on that you think could save people some time and pain?
That's so interesting. Yeah. I started doing game stuff a little late. I mean, it could have been earlier, I feel like, and I could have been a even better designer early on, right? Because I started in grad school, technically. I did a little bit of stuff in undergrad, but it was not super formal. And so, all the lessons I learned in grad school was like, oh man, I wish I would have started some of this stuff earlier, right? As far as making a portfolio, right? And just making games with people, just purely getting people together and making stuff together and exploring the tool sets and stuff like that. And so I always kind of advocate for get started and make stuff with people, right? But I think early career wise, it's so tricky right now because there's this dynamic of, people trying to get into the industry as get their first job, which is a crapshoot. Always kind of been a crapshoot, but even more now, right? And so that's a tricky dynamic that is for that. At this moment, the thing that I keep falling back on is just getting together with other people who are doing that and working together and trying to find people of like mind to make things together and support each other in this process. And of course, try to stay creative about how you apply your skill sets and things that you're interested in and, things that you have learned in school or personally in the game process and thinking of ways that can be applied in different scenarios and for different opportunities. Because as we talked about earlier with the consultation and the culturalization stuff is the hard thing now, more so than what it's been in the past, it feels like for all creatives is that we have to be our own advocates even more than what we've had to do in the past, as far as knowing what we do, knowing the value in what we bring, and making sure other people understand it too. And it takes time to figure that out. And it also takes a skill to chip away at that and how to present that and how to explain it to other people. And we have to do it in a way that's also online these days as well. And so as creatives, people who are indie and getting into the industry to get their first job, it feels like it's almost a requirement now that we have to be attentive to that piece of the puzzle and, do it with friends, do it solo. So I think that's the thing at this point that feels valuable is to kind of keep that in mind, be an advocate for yourself as much as you can and try to find other people to do that stuff with in that process who you can talk to, you can practice with and excel in that way. And I'm hoping that with the work that I'm doing personally with our studio, with our nonprofit stuff, that we're also providing spaces for people to get that practice and get that experience and work with people in like-minded ways to level up, either to get the job or to get the work opportunities or make work opportunities in that process.
Especially now that it's just such a great tie to the theme I'm trying to get for the podcast, which is that community, right? You're talking about connecting people. You're find people, your peers, not the people 20 years in front of you, but find people in the past with you now to build things with you now to help you figure out who you are and to build that portfolio, to build that collection of work you're proud of.
Bonus level, proudest work.
On that note, one last question I'll ask. What work are you most proud of?
Oh man, it feels like there's a lot of things.
Well, that's good. That's a good problem to have.
Right. It's true. And there's different things I'm proud of for different reasons. So I'll say that as a creative in games, the moment I'm most proud of, and I hope people will be able to see it because it's not released yet, but I am very proud of the work I did at Brass Lion with the Wu-Tang action RPG, because I think that project represents the combination of all the things that I've kind of talked about today, from a cultural perspective, from a gameplay perspective, from a narrative perspective, and from a intention. It is something that combines those things together in a way that's in a really nice package for everybody to enjoy. And so I do hope that when that releases, people will be able to experience that as a creative work. Obviously, worked on a lot of amazing projects, but that one takes everything into the pot. And so I'm very proud of that work. And then, of course, I think also largely just like the community that we've built over the past 5 years or so in our Discord spaces, and just like the people that have been able to, we've met and have been able to make connections, and that continued building of that community space. I remember when it was not much and how hard that was and how hard it was to keep it going, and been really beautiful to see how things have been blossoming and kind of taking their own energy over time.
I will keep my fingers crossed that we will all be able to see that culmination of all of the things you talked with us about sooner rather than later.
Loading. Final podcast level. Links and follow-up.
How can people follow your work or participate in the communities you mentioned? We talked about the clock out at 2. We talked about Black and Gaming. Like if people want to look into your class or follow you personally, and the Melanated Game Kitchen. So many things. What would you recommend?
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that. You can find me on Blue Sky. I think I have some stuff on IG at Tim Status, TimStatis, on those platforms and probably other platforms. You can find our work on Black and Gaming, blackandgamingfoundation.com. You can just look us up on Black and Gaming, support us there, donate, all that kind of stuff. And then for the Melanated Game Kitchen, we're on itch.io. And also they're connected to most of my links as well. So just look us up on Google. You'll find us there. We're also on YouTube. We'll be doing some video content soon, and also launching a Patreon for people to kind of get an inside look at what we're up to, and also the culturalization process and analysis of games and those kinds of things, and curation, especially curating interesting games for people to check out that they maybe haven't thought about and why they should check it out. So we'll be doing some of that stuff. Clock out at 2. We're on Steam. Give us a wish list. We haven't announced a release date yet, but we're hoping towards the end of the year if we're lucky. But we will be launching a Kickstarter this spring is our plan. So just keep an eye out for that. We have a newsletter and all that kind of stuff. So check us out on Steam. And yeah, well, hopefully I'll be able to play an updated demo soon.
Can't wait. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was such a fascinating discussion for me, and I learned a lot, and I can't wait to play your work
Appreciate it, Cheryl.
and see the evolution of your educational work too. So thank you so much for your time, Timothy.
Likewise. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it a lot. Yes.
Continue exploring the craft of game development with my book that inspired this podcast, The Game Development Strategy Guide. Available worldwide from your favorite online bookseller or from my publisher, rosenfeldmedia.com. Enduring Play listeners can get 15% off at rosenfeldmedia.com through July 31st, 2026, using the code EnduringPlayS2. Check out Season 1 of this podcast for the interviews that helped inspire the book, or tune in next time for interviews that help expand our understanding of what it takes to create games that don't just survive, but thrive. I'm your host, Cheryl Platts. Until next time, keep thriving.
Initiating final credits sequence. Podcast. Enduring Play. Created and produced by Cheryl Platts. Copyright Idea Platts, LLC. All rights reserved. Explore the podcast at enduringplay.com. Podcast theme composed by Cheryl Platts. To learn more about Cheryl's books, visit rosenfeldmedia.com. Follow Idea Platts on Instagram, YouTube, or Blue Sky, IDEAPLATZ. To learn more about Idea Platts, the design education consultancy, visit ideaplatts.com. Thank you to David Dema for episode quality assurance. For book and podcast merch, go to ideaplatts.dashery.com.